certainly merits a lot of discussion, as much as the climate change topic itself, I would say. So what I intend to do in the next 5 to 10 minutes is quickly set the context in terms of what this challenge of water is really all about. We have all been speaking and hearing a lot about the climate change challenge. But somehow, when it comes to water, we probably don't see the same level of stakeholder focus, the same kind of attention which, let's say, the climate change challenge gets today. So what I intend to do in the next 15 minutes is quickly give you a sense of what this is all about, how really it does manifest itself in the form of global and local repercussions, and what could be the state-of-the-art possible opportunities for us to really address this challenge as we move forward together as a community. So with that, let's just get started. Go to the next slide, please. So this is a very quick view of what this challenge is all about at the heart of it. At the heart of it, this is really about demand-supply gap. If you think about what exactly is the demand for freshwater withdrawals globally, we have seen that there is a steady rise in the overall consumption of water, the overall demand for water. And it's evident from data over the last decade that the overall water demand has increased from almost about 4,500 million cubic meters to almost about 6,900 million cubic meters expected by 2030. Now this is just to give you a sense of the magnitude of demand that we have seen in the steady rise that is witnessing over the past decade or so. Now, if you were to put it into perspective and think about how does the demand play or reconcile with the supply that we have available at hand, the research and the estimates tell us that by 2030, the overall supply of fresh water is only going to be about 4,200 million cubic meters. And that starts to give you a sense of what this overall demand-supply gap is all about. That starts to talk about really what this challenge is all about. Almost a 40% deficit is what we are looking at as we move forward in terms of the demand-supply gap. Now this, of course, is a very quick view of the demand-supply gap, but having said that, this is not the only way in which water challenge manifests itself. You know, this is the root cause, but then we see that it starts to manifest itself in the form of, let's say, challenges with respect to access to clean water, challenges with respect to access to sanitation, hygiene, all of those kind of challenges start to kind of have kind of a cascading impact when we think about this demand-supply gap. Of course, it manifests in the form of economic challenges as well. Very clearly, the data tells us that the water challenge is going to have an impact of almost about 6% of the global GDP is going to be addressed just because of the water deficit that we are witnessing and expecting over the next few years. In terms of the societal impact, we are all aware of the challenges specifically in the context of India with respect to the access to clean water, with respect to the access to sanitation and hygiene and those kind of basic necessities. Now, as I said, this is the overall global context. But if we were to think and really turn our attention to the Indian context, let's just look at what that means. This is a very quick view of an Indian version of the demand-supply gap that we just talked about a short while back. Now I said that the supply is expected to be about 6,900 billion cubic meters by 2030. In the Indian context, that supply is going to be about 1,500 billion cubic meters, almost about 1/4 or 1/5 of the global supply. And if we were to compare that with the overall demand that we are expecting by 2030 in the Indian context, it's going to be about 750 billion cubic meters. Now that starts to tell us why exactly we need to be worried about the water challenge. It's almost a deficit of 50%. The demand is almost half of what the supply is almost half of what the demand is expected to be in the next 8 odd years. So that's a very quick view of how this challenge is kind of playing out in the Indian context. Now, if you were to think about exactly what does it mean for us as a nation, of course, as I said, this is a challenge which manifests in multiple forms. If you think about different states, you would have at the same time, you would have scenarios wherein a state is grappling with, let's say, floods, and at the same time, there could be another state which is grappling with drought. So, the different avatars in which this challenge can actually play out are very different. And this view that you see here in the form of a map of India is a very quick view from a recent composite water management index that was launched by Niti Aayog. Very clearly, without getting into the details, if you see a red spot or an amber spot, it tells you that these are the challenges, these are the areas which are going to experience water stress as compared to the green pockets. barring a couple of states, most of the country is expected to experience some kind of a challenge as we move forward. So very clearly there is a need for us to really get together and think about what can be done to address this challenge as a nation as we move forward. Now let's move one slide further. Now, what I intend to do now is, having spoken about exactly what is the root cause, which is what we said is about the demand-supply gap, really think about two things. One, what is the macro view in terms of how this is kind of playing out across the globe, and then a very micro view for us as individuals, as citizens of the country, what does it mean? So for example, when we think about some of these macro numbers, it's not very intuitive as to what would one do if you were to think about as an individual, is there something different that one can do when we walk out of this conference. So what you see here is a very clear view of where is the water demand coming from. If we were to take an average view across the globe, it's evident that almost 70% of the fresh water withdrawals are happening for agricultural needs, and then of course the balance is split across industrial needs and individual needs for the people of the world. Now, if you turn your attention to the right-hand side of the view, it's a world map. Of course, it has a few details. I wouldn't want to necessarily have you scan through all the things that you see in the legend. But all it tries to tell you is that the spots where you see a green color, these are the parts of the world, these are the regions of the world which are having a lot of dependence on agricultural water requirements. As compared to that, if you were to think about, let's say, what you see here in North America or Europe, these are the areas which are expected to have a lot of water reliance coming in the form of industrial water demand. So just goes to show that there isn't a one size fits all kind of an approach which one can take when you're trying to address the water challenge. Depending on which country, which locality, which region are you talking about, the manifestation of water challenge could be very different. And hence the need to think about the solutions, hence the technological innovations which are required by that region would differ quite significantly. Now, that was a very high-level view in terms of the demand-supply gap. We looked at some of the patterns in terms of where the demand is coming from and how that varies across the regions. But what I want to now turn our attention to is a very micro view. If we were to think about an individual's water consumption, how does it really play out? Now, it's a known fact that typically, on an average, an individual needs about 200 to 225 liters of water on a daily basis. When I say 200 to 225 liters of water on a daily basis, I'm really referring to things like drinking water needs, washing water needs, and then typical daily needs that one thinks about. But that is actually not the full picture. This is just the real physical water consumption that takes place on a daily basis. But if you were to think about all the consumptions that we do in the form of the choices that we make in terms of what we eat, the choices that we make in terms of how we commute, the choices that we make in terms of lifestyle, everything has an associated water footprint. And then that is where the concept of virtual water is much more a reliable way of thinking about what is exactly the demand for water. So for instance, if you were to think about some simple things like, let's say, a t-shirt, there are a lot of research which tell you that a simple cotton t-shirt would require almost about 2,000 liters of water, which is required during the consumption process, during the manufacturing process. If you were to think about, let's say, a simple A4 size sheet, things that we usually take for granted, there is almost 10 liters of water which is consumed in really bringing a paper to its form when we actually use it for printing purposes. Now, if you were to add all of those things in the form of virtual water or the embedded water, which an individual uses on a daily basis, the actual demand for water, again on an average, actually shoots up to something like 4,000 liters on a daily basis, up from 200 liters, which is just the physical requirement that I just talked about. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because when we start to think about what we could do as individuals, there is obviously a lot of nuance that one has to be aware of. So just thinking about rationalizing our daily water needs in the form of washing and bathing is not going to help solve this challenge. It needs to be a much more broader and a much more holistic approach that one has to think about. Now this again is a very quick view of that exploded, kind of an overlay of what the typical water need is on a daily basis. Very clearly there is this small bar that you see at the center, which is about 220 odd liters. This this is, as I said, the physical water consumption that happens on a daily basis. But then you also see a lot of green bars, a lot of amber bars all along. And that is where the point that I was trying to make in terms of the choices that we make start to become very evident. So for example, if you were to move to the Western world, where obviously the non-veg consumption is much more than, let's say, in our part of the world, all of that has embedded water. All of that has implications in terms of what is the water requirement coming from upstream parts of dairy and agricultural food that's going through it. Very similarly, if we were to think about our daily choices that we make in terms of the kind of food that we consume, in terms of the choice of clothes that we wear, all of that has an implication in terms of what is the upstream part of the water that gets consumed, really bringing those products to life before they get consumed eventually. So the simple point that I want to make is that life choices matter. It's not agnostic. Even if we don't see water being directly consumed in everything that we kind of aware on a daily basis, there is a hidden or a virtual water that has been absorbed or consumed from the nature in bringing it to its current form. So we need to be all aware of that. Now, maybe I'll just spend 30 seconds on this, given that I represent the firm called Accenture. What is Accenture doing in this space? So as a corporate, what we have done is we have defined 3 big goals for ourselves, or 3 big commitments for ourselves, which we want to meet by 2025. The first one is really about climate change, wherein we have announced a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2025. The second one is really about waste. We have again announced a commitment to become zero waste by 2025. And the third one is around water, wherein we have announced a commitment to identify the areas of water stress, given that we as a corporate have operations in almost about 190 plus countries. So we are preparing a detailed plan in terms of what exactly are the vulnerabilities in the regions in which we operate, in the regions in which we support our clients, and think about exactly what are the kind of hyper-local solutions that we can adopt to be able to address those water challenges in as I said, 190 plus countries that we operate in. Now, before I conclude, I just want to draw our attention to what are the key enablers which can help us bridge the demand-supply gap that I talked about, address some of the water challenges that I alluded to a short while back. And very clearly, there are 3 big levers or 3 big enablers that one can think about. So the first one, of course, is technology. I know we talked about a few numbers. We said that the global demand is going to be about 6,900 billion cubic meters. Now, if you were to think about where exactly can one start to rationalize, where exactly can one start to save water, these are just some data points which tell you that if one were to think about adopting, let's say, ICT-based solutions with respect to the withdrawals of groundwater, there could almost be a saving of about 300 billion cubic meters out of that 6,900 billion cubic meters that I talked about. Of course, very small as compared to the overall demand, but it is a step in the right direction. Similarly, if we were to think about things like the kind of power production that we have, as I said, everything has an associated implication for water. It's not just water that you need to think about when you're trying to solve the water challenge, but there are a lot of accompanying things which are so intricately linked to the concept of water that it has an impact. So for example, just by shifting from fossil fuel-based sources to more renewable power, there is an implication in terms of what is the quantum of water that one can save in terms of the demand. So technology has a big role to play in that. Behavior, yes, it is important. It is important specifically because this is where we as individuals can start to make an impact immediately. Of course, the impact needs to be conceptualized at multiple levels, as an individual, as a corporate, as a nation. But as an individual, we're talking about what could we do. This is where the behavioral aspects come into play, the kind of choices that we make on a daily basis. I'll just give one simple example. We did a piece of research and we found that just by eliminating or saying no to single-use plastic, one could actually reduce the water demand in India by about 27 billion cubic meters. Again, a drop in the ocean, but at least a step in the right direction. And then lastly, I think given the nature of this challenge, given how convoluted this challenge is all about, there isn't one player that can really address this. It requires a partnership, it requires a collaboration-based approach. If I were to just, again, give you an example in terms of how this manifests in a way wherein an individual entity cannot necessarily address it all by itself. Just think about a simple car that we drive. Now, all these cars obviously get manufactured in some kind of manufacturing facilities. Now, what is the water consumption that happens with respect to really bringing a particular automobile vehicle to of course there is a footprint. Now if as an automobile company one were to think about how much water demand you can rationalize by taking initiatives within the boundaries of the factory, it's a very small number, but just about 33 million cubic meters. But if one were to think about what is the overall potential to reduce or rationalize water demand, which is required to really bring it to life in terms of one vehicle, if you were to take a value chain based approach, there is almost 1200 million cubic meters worth of water or quantity of water that one can save. And of course, if you're thinking about a value chain based approach, it cannot be something that we can pursue in isolation or as an individual entity. That is where a partnership based approach really comes to life. So with that, I'll take a quick pause. I think the key message I want to leave you with is that unlike climate change, this is a challenge which manifests in multiple forms. There is a need for action at individual level, corporate level, and macro level. And there are just three key enablers which one can think about when you start to solve or problem solve this kind of a challenge, which is around technology, the digital devices, there is behavioral aspect to it, and then of course there is a partnerships-based approach, which is also the need of the hour. With that, I'll take a pause, and I'm sure my fellow speakers are also going to talk about some of those very specific technologies which one can leverage to really address this problem as a country. Thank you.